Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing George Avelino, who received an undergraduate degree in history from the Catholic Pontificate University of Rio de Janeiro, a master's in sociology from the University of São Paulo, and a doctorate in political science from Stanford University. He is currently a professor at the Fundação Getulio Vargas in São Paulo, and his research focuses on elections, political parties, electoral coalitions, and many other topics. So, George, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you again for your invitation.
So let's just jump right into the situation. What are the electoral outcomes looking like at this point?
Surprisingly, the electoral outcomes seems stable. So it's a kind of very stable picture. And I don't expect this to change very much in the near future, because in political science, we don't have many rules, but we have this one. It's called the Duverger rule, meaning that if you have just one seat in dispute, the tendency is to converge on only two competitive candidates. Meaning that if Lula and Bolsonaro, they got all those votes, 50 or 66%, doesn't matter at this point, they probably, what you're gonna see is they are gonna, voters for other candidates, they're gonna abandon those candidates and decide to vote for one of these, either Lula or Bolsonaro, or none. They're going to vote null or something like this. So I expect this scenario to be very stable until October.
And what are the reasons that political scientists attribute to the fact that people will abandon the lesser candidates, the candidates who are receiving less poll numbers to go to one of the two leading candidates? Why does that happen?
Because people want to get their vote counted. If you vote for a third place in this situation, you have Lula about 40-something% of the votes, Bolsonaro, latest polls are 46 to 28, but doesn't matter at this point because we're not dealing with exact numbers. But if Lula is a kind of ahead, Bolsonaro is kind of a runner-up, the clear runner-up. So the third, the fourth, and the fifth candidate, and so on, voters, they don't have incentives to vote for one of these candidates because they know in advance that those votes will not be counted. Presidential elections are a majoritarian one, meaning if you don't vote for the winner candidate, your vote's not counted at all.
So there's a tendency for people to abandon the third way candidates that have been polling at 2 or 3%, or in the case of Ciro Gomes, 6 or 8%, to go to either Bolsonaro or Lula. So what might happen in the second round with the situation of Ciro Gomes's supporters, who at this point are kind of hovering around 6 to 8%? Are they likely to go towards Lula? Are they likely to split their vote? Or are they likely to annul their votes? What do you think might happen to that block? That's an important block that can make the difference between one candidate or the other.
Sure. I believe that Ciro Gomes voters will go mostly for Lula against Bolsonaro, because in the second round, you have to vote for the least kind of rejected. So they would prefer Lula against Bolsonaro. Once both facing this choice, they'll say mostly they will go for Lula instead of Bolsonaro. Of course, some minority may go to Bolsonaro, and some other chunk may not go to the polls or may vote new or something, reject both candidates. But I think most will go for Lula at this point.
And how do you see the question of the polls? How can we trust the polls, the reliability of the polls? Do they really accurately reflect the voter intention, or are they distorted in some way?
I think they do. Brazil has been already not as long as other countries because our democratic tradition is very short compared to European and United States, for example. But they have been having elections every 2 years. So the pollsters are even getting better at this point. So they may diverge about the methodology. For example, they are going to face-to-face interviews, or telephonic interviews or even computer-assisted interviews, but they probably will converge to a number. I mean, those differences now, mostly about from the posters that are very well known, that have a reputation to preserve in the market, for example, they probably will convert. There are differences more because of methodology, the number of questionnaires they launch, and this kind of thing. So if you have a smaller number of respondents, you probably have a larger error. So you can have difference because of this thing. If you, the same poster, the same pool with more questionnaires will probably converge to the other one.
And I've also read that those polls in which they only interview people on telephone, whether that's the iPhone or a landline, are less accurate than people being interviewed in person. Could you explain why there's a difference in the results based on the way in which people are actually interviewed, how the results are found?
Yeah, it's easier to get answers from people if you are face-to-face. Here in Brazil, this kind of definite thing. You can also have some answers from phone, but when people are calling some other people, I mean, it's not kind of automatic, or computer, something like this, a recording. No? So I believe that face-to-face are more accurate because the enumerators can go further with trying to get out an answer for the interviewer. So I believe it's kind of if you have kind of a hierarchy, it would be face-to-face, telephonic, using people phoning to each other, and less the computer assistant, this kind of thing with a recording.
I would also assume that some poor people who might vote for Lula might not have telephones or be used to answering telephone calls of people they don't know and answering a questionnaire. So that could, I assume, could distort the results as well. I don't know if that's the case.
Maybe, but I think that kind of in Brazil now, everybody has a cell phone. Everybody can be called. The list of cell phones are kind of very throughout. I mean, they're very specific. They can get all phones. So maybe there is kind of a bias regarding the thing you call. I mean, poor people don't have cell phones, but probably it's not a very large one. I mean, moreover, you are asking very little to the data. I mean, you're just asking, we're going to vote. It's kind of a simple question. There's not very complex question. Again, this all depends on the complexity of the questionnaire you're doing, because the more complex, the more observation you need, the more precise you need to be to extract the information you want to. But now I just want who I'm going to vote for.
So that's pretty direct, and people can give a pretty direct answer. So there has been talk in recent weeks about the threats of the current president doing something to discredit the elections or to not recognize the electoral votes should he not win. What is your analysis of the dangers to the democratic process at this point?
This should depend on the position of the army force on this situation. Bolsonaro, you can call Bolsonaro a lot of things, but he's not a liar in a sense that he's saying that he's going to do something like the Capitol invasion on the January 6th that happened in the US last year. He's going to do something like this because he's now, he has been saying that the elections are going to be rigged some way against him, of course. And so he's going to mobilize his voters to do something like this, to jump the table, to turn off the table, I mean, to cancel elections or this kind of thing. So this is always going to depend on the army forces. And some information, because information from the army force are not very specific. So some people say that they are out of this plan. They have a kind of a line. They won't go further of this line. But some other people say, oh, it depends on Bolsonaro, depends, because you have to consider there are a lot of military in the government now. I mean, they estimate numbers 8,000 militaries in government. It's a lot. It's more than we had in the military dictatorship in Brazil in previous times. So a lot of military there. So the president or the election, they probably Lula, because If you are opposing Lula to Bolsonaro, if Bolsonaro wins, things will remain the way they are right now. The one who has incentive to change those things is Lula once he elected. So if Lula wins, he'll have to kind of strike a deal with the military, with a kind of maybe it's a progressive transition. I mean, getting these people out of government back to their barracks or this kind of thing, to their professional duties, but this is going to be kind of a slowly thing, a slow process, much like Tancredo Neves, the deal Tancredo Neves struck in the transition to the military dictatorship to democracy. In many things, we are facing a similar situation.
But do you anticipate that Bolsonaro might mobilize his base of support? He has a strength of 20 to 30% of the population. There's a tradition now since at least 2015 to mobilize in the streets, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. Do you think there's a possibility that should the outcome be close, or should he feel that he should have been elected, that he might actually mobilize his base of support into the streets that could try to pressure the armed forces to take a stand or create a political tension or violence that could provoke the interference of the armed forces?
No, certainly. I mean, the electoral results going to be important, going to play an important role on this future situation, because if the election is close, Bolsonaro will have more arguments to say, okay, the election was rigged, I was robbed, they kind of didn't count those votes, this kind of thing. Many arguments are possible in this kind of situation. That's why the election is still important. I mean, as I said, the picture is kind of frozen, but I believe that Lula is going to win the election unless something really new happened, and I don't expect those things, many things to happen, because you are dealing with two experienced candidates. Lula got many previous presidential elections before. Probably he won't make any kind of large mistake that are going to change the elections. The same thing applies to Bolsonaro. I don't believe he's going to make a large mistake or this kind of thing. But I still believe Lula is going to win because the economy in Brazil is doing very badly. So you have high rate of inflation. Now they're in the press this week. It's going to be the inflation rate, the annual inflation rate is over 12%. It's higher since the last 20 years, since 2003. So it's kind of almost 20 years we didn't have this kind of inflation. The inflation hitting badly a lot of people, mostly poor people, who are the ones who suffer most from inflation. The unemployment rate is still high. It's about 13%. It's really high for Brazilian patterns. So I think the economy is going to hit Bolsonaro hardly, and it's going to make Lula win the election. But the difference, getting back to the initial question, the difference between them is going to be important, because the closer the results, the more feasible claim for Bolsonaro that he was robbed, the elections kind of rigged, this kind of thing.
So in the United States, the Trump supporters who also challenged the election results, and many still believe that Trump won the elections, made the argument that the electing voting machines in the United States were fraudulent, that they were rigged, that they were controlled by outside forces. Now, in the United States, every different state has its own electoral processes, its own voting machines, its own way of counting the votes. And none of these claims have been proven valid as they've gone to court and have been adjudicated. But in Brazil, Bolsonaro is also claiming that the voting machine, the electronic polling machines, are potentially a vehicle for fraud. How much can people rely on the voting machines that are used in Brazil nationwide?
Brazil introduced voting machines, electronic voting machines, in the second half of the 90s. It was a very important thing, because for the first time, the illiterate people could really vote, because pressing some numbers is something you do in your daily life. If you go over using an elevator, for example, you're going to press a number to get the floor you want to. So it's kind of an easy thing to do. Before that, they have to write either the number or the name of the candidates, they probably won't be able to do this. So for the first time, you have included these illiterate people in the real way.
So just to clarify to our listeners and to our viewers, in Brazil, each party has a given number. It's a number assigned to it. Yeah. And people can vote for the entire ticket by just putting in that number and pressing the button for that, and then pressing a green button saying that that's the result. Or they can actually vote for individual candidates, all of which have numbers that begin with the number of the party. So if you know the number of your party, you can vote for candidates, whether or not you're able to read their names clearly if you're semi-literate. So that's what you're referring to when you say voting by numbers, okay?
That's right. And so in Brazil, the introduction of the electronic vote. And look, there's one thing I discuss with my students. Why do Brazil need an electronic vote? Why don't we have electronic votes all over the world? Why don't we have electronic votes in the US, for example? Because the ticket in the US is a very simple one. As there is just one seat in dispute, and even for federal representatives, the United States has 435 seats in dispute around the country. There's just one seat in dispute per district. So the tendency is to have a small number of candidates. I mean, okay, you have a Republican, you have a Democrat, you may have some other independent or some other small party, but again, the Republican, the Democrat, you get the lion's share of the votes, and everybody knows this. So it's kind of you can have a ticket with a few numbers, and the voter just need to make a cross around the name he wants to vote for. So it's a kind of simple thing to do. And you don't have to be literate or something like that. You're not requiring too much for voters. And you're not requiring too much for counting votes, because then the ticket's going to be okay. You can separate tickets for groups of voters or groups of candidates. And it's kind of easy thing to do. In Brazil, in São Paulo, in 2018, you had more than 1,000 candidates for federal representative. You just get just one vote. So it's kind of a hard thing. Imagine a kind of a ticket with more than 1,000 candidates put in order. It's going to be hard to read, and nobody's going to be confusing. Nobody's going to be able to vote. So the electronic vote, again, is kind of something that makes this voting process easier, considering the number of parties, the number of candidates you have here for federal representative.
So also to clarify to our listeners and viewers, in Brazil, the party's overall vote is tallied, and then the candidates who are elected by the voters from that party with the highest number of votes, given a certain quota of the number of people who pass a threshold, are seated in Congress. So it depends on the overall total votes for the political party and the sum of all the votes of the different candidates, and then your actual ranking in competition with other candidates, which makes it a very confusing system, given the fact there are also 28 political parties in Congress at this point, or 29. It keeps on changing. So talking about the elections and the Congress, what are your predictions for the outcomes in the congressional elections? I know you've been studying them district by district, or area of the country by area of the country for quite a while. What are your predictions for the congressional outcomes in the House, or the Câmara de Deputados, the House of Deputies, or the Chamber of Deputies, in which all of the members will be up for re-election, and a third of those in the Senate? What are your predictions?
I mean, I think in the House, I expect the future House to be more or less like this one. Why? Because we have money, never had so much money in a House election. For example, we had the 2018 elections. We have a budget of 2 billion reais. That's okay. The election happened. Nobody complained except for Bolsonaro, but for different reasons, not because of the lack of money or this kind of thing. And nobody complained about lacking money. So from 2018 to 2022, we expect this amount of 2 billion reais to be just adjusted by inflation. I mean, okay, have the present value of this money because consider the past inflation, this kind of thing. But no, they got from 2 billion to 5 billion. It's about, now it's kind of $1 billion for financing elections. Okay, that's going to be a big jump, much more money in the electoral market. But beside that, they also have something that's hard to explain. It's a kind of public budget that is secret. A part of the public budget is secret because it's going to be managed by House or in Senate members, so they can address those money to their mayors who support them, or to municipalities, or people who support them in their municipality. Meaning they will have lots of money that's compared to other elections. So I expect them to be kind of the winners in this election. So more or less, just consider that PT may grow up a little bit, PSDB may diminish their members of representatives, some other things here, but those are marginal changes considered to the Congress. So it's one of the challenge an eventual Lula term will have is to how am I going to deal with this Congress? Centrão is going to be there, everybody's going to be there. So how's going to make a kind of a government coalition in the House to support the new government? That's going to a first challenge. That's going to be a very important one, because some way, somehow, if you are a president, you have to get back control over the public budget. That's one task you have to. If you're a president, you want to do some things, and you have control of the public budget. So it's going to be the first challenge for an eventual Lula term.
So Lula has in his electoral coalition brought, I think, 7 parties into his coalition so far, and he's building alliances with sectors of other political parties to support him. So he's building a broad coalition. But as you pointed out, the center right, what's called in Brazil the Centrão, or the big center, controls the Congress, controls the chief officers and the committees, and it seems likely that they will continue in power. So how is Lula going to expand his support so he can get anything passed in the Congress? What is he going to need to do in order to get legislation approved?
He was able to deal with the center right in his past terms. But the thing now is they're kind of make an advance. Now, for example, budgetary amendments from the House and from the Senate are now impositive, meaning that the government cannot kind of delay the execution of this budgetary item. And more or less, this kind of the part of the public budget which is secret. So they're gonna make a lot of adjustments. They are kind of have some trenches in the public budget that then is going to be the hard thing for Lula to get back. I mean, dealing with Centrão, many people, even from Centrão, for example, politicians that are the center right, but they are from the northeast part of the country, where Lula is very popular. They say, okay, Lula is not bad, Lula is good. I can work with Lula as I did in the past, this kind of thing. That's not going to be the challenge. The challenge is going to be to get control back over the budget, which is kind of a crucial thing if you want to make some policy change. And we need very many policy changes, because we need to change policy, because Bolsonaro has kind of disorganized the public apparatus in Brazil in crucial areas such as health, education. We have kind of this dealing with COVID. It's not because of the past institution, because Bolsonaro had tried to destroy the SUS. That's kind of a Obamacare, similar to Obamacare in the US. It's a kind of a very universal assistance, and health and education and environment. Environment is kind of a bad thing, very bad in environment. And if you want to do something about this, you want to do policy, renew some policy on those areas, you need to have control over the budget.
So it seems that the current government has been spending, and again, the electoral campaign does not allow for corporations to make donations, but it only allows for government funding and individual donations. So the majority of the money, the large majority of the money going into the election campaigns of the parties is through public funding. And so this has been increased, as you've mentioned. But one of the problems that it seems to be happening is that there's been what is called time bombs being planted within the budgetary structure, so that things have been spent with no income, no revenue to pay for them, and it's all going to land on the next government, in which these expenditures, payments will be due, and the new government's going to have to find revenue to pay for them. What are the possibilities that Lula has to deal with those kinds of problems should he be elected in October?
Well, he had to deal with some issues in 2002 when he first got elected, because inflation was high, the dollar value against the real was skyrocketing. So he kind of was able, and he had a kind of a reputation of not being responsible, fiscally responsible. So I think it's going to be one of the first things he's going to focus on, because he's very clear about this. He knows that inflation kills any Brazilian government. Doesn't matter which is in power. If you have a high inflation, you're going to be down. So I think he's going to be put effort on this. That's why the regaining control of the budget is kind of a crucial thing. And that's by the Centrão. One thing that I forgot was the elections are going to be funded by public money, and it's going to go to parties who's going to distribute among their respective candidates. This is one thing, but who controls the party? Who are the party rulers? The party rulers are the federal elected incumbents, either in the House or in the Senate. So they're going to get the lion's share. That's why I expect them to do quite well in the next election. Of course, some surprise can happen here and there, but I mean, the tendency is for them to get reelected in the most part.
George, you've lived in the United States. You got your PhD from Stanford. You understand the ways in which Americans know very little about Brazil when you talk to them. And one of the goals of Brazil Unfiltered is to educate people and expand their horizons and their knowledge of the country. But if you were to try to explain to a colleague at Stanford about what's going on in Brazil in this last period, how would you explain it to the person? What would you tell them about what's happening in Brazil in the election year?
Well, let's see. What's happening in Brazil is kind of not very different from what happened in the US, what happened in other countries around Hungary and even in France. The center right kind of almost won the presidential election. And so I think what's the reason for? I believe this reason is kind of general discontent about the inequality. I mean, it's not random that inequality has raised again as an issue of academic concern, because it was kind of put dormant for kind of 2 decades and then got back as a real important issue. So it's a kind of a concern about inequality. Brazil has been championed in inequality as a very unequal country, even for comparing to their neighbors here in South America. But so what changed then? Inequality is the same. What changed in Brazil? I believe what changed in Brazil, there's some kind of me trying to make some hypothesis here, is that there is more access to the public sphere than it was before, and this was promoted by internet, Twitter, this kind of thing. So now people, before the internet, before Twitter, before this kind of those other programs that can provide you access to the internet, the access to the public sphere was kind of very regulated, very controlled. So if you remember that the speaker corner in the London Park, and that's kind of a folklore thing, because the guy has a small thing but they try to make a speech for people who's not listen to him or this kind of thing, or to her. But it's a kind of unregulated access to the public sphere. And then I have this thing. And I believe then this kind of Bolsonaro use a lot the internet, use a lot their social networks and this kind of thing. And I believe it's kind of what's the base of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is somehow, some way, like Trump in the US, they are trying to destroy the system and are getting support for people who's going to be left behind by the system. So the system is bad, let's destroy it. So it's kind of a program that is similar in the US than in Brazil and Hungary and other countries in the world who are suffering the same thing. So let's put the thing down. The system is bad for us. And so it's a kind of a combination of some countries raising inequality, don't forget that in the US, the inequality raised a lot in the last decades, a lot. The US was much more equal before than it is right now. So I think there's kind of this movement, this political movement, who got their representatives in these charismatic leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban in Hungary. And so there's kind of living the same nightmare. And you have to have an answer for those discontents. I mean, if you want to get stability back, you have to face this thing. You cannot live with this kind of inequality, mostly in this new world of social networks, in certain ways right, in other ways wrong, but they provide information for a large amount of people, and they provide access to the public sphere, making this debate much more disorganized than it was before. So how can we have to reduce inequality some way, somehow? That's why the victory of Lula in Brazil would mean a lot for Brazilians, in a sense that he's representing a change toward the right direction, not replacing Bolsonaro, but a change in the right direction for the country.
That sounds like a very optimistic ending to your story. What are your hopes for the year 2023?
I mean, it's going to be hard. I believe that Lula has a very good chance to win this election, as I said before, except for something really different, really exogenous for the election. I mean, some like the stab Bolsonaro in the 2018 or something like this. Really important may need to happen to change the current situation. But it's going to be hard for him just to take the office because of the thing like we said before. Bolsonaro is going to try to make some chaos, to bring some chaos, some turmoil. That's why it's kind of is the best environment when the chaos, turmoil, disorganization. That's why the police, the army force, they are required because they have to bring back order, and that's why Bolsonaro sees his opportunity. Has always been like this, never changed, and even after taking office, I believe he's going to face a lot of challenges. And that's why I kind of very optimistic, because I think you have the right person in the right time. And but doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It's going to be very hard, and we have a lot of difficult tasks, complex tasks to solve in the near future.
And finally, one last question before we end the program. Lula has chosen for his vice presidential candidate Chiraldo Almano, who was the former governor of the state of São Paulo, ran for president twice. In the last election race, he got 4.8% of the votes, running on the Brazilian Social Democracy Party. Some people in the Workers' Party were not sure that was a good idea to bring into the fold someone who had been in an opposition political party. What do you think will be the effect of Almano on the electoral campaign and on the Lula government if Lula is elected?
That's a good point. I believe that Alckmin as a vice president is going to be more important in the government than in the election. I don't believe Alckmin doesn't have too many votes to mobilize, but it's a very good sign of Lula that he's going to want to make a government, a wider government. I mean, having a broader coalition. That's a coalition to defend and to enlarge democracy and to attack the inequality. I believe that's the concern with inequality, fortunately, has been more widespread right now in Brazil too. So we can make a coalition that getting back liberals, center, but democratic and Republican in a sense, not in the Republican Party, Republican in the sense that Republican institutions and to defend those institutions. So this is gonna a right step in the right way again. And Alckmin is going to help Lula in that kind of the face of the government is going to be a face of any radical, because Alckmin, you can say anything about Alckmin, but not he's a radical person, a radical politician. So it's going to be a sign that the government is going to be radical, or in another word, it's going to be radical in a right sense. It's going to be radical because the task it has to face against are very complex, are very difficult, and we need to be radical. We have to change the country. But I believe you can change the country, defend democracy, enlarge democracy. You have a broader coalition. Don't need PT. Of course, in PT, you have some complaints. PT is like any other party. PT has a lot of different groups inside of it. So any party it's not kind of a homogeneous. You don't expect any party to be homogeneous. And you see parties in the US, they are not homogeneous at all. A Democrat can be very different from the state they came from, or the same is for a Republican politician.
Well, thank you, George, for this wonderful interview. I appreciate your being willing to come and join us on Brazil Unfiltered. And we'll be back in touch as the elections get closer to see if you can join us for more analyses of what's going on in Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll be ready to get back here. I like very much this Brazil Unfiltered. I think it's a kind of a very good effort, which I praise a lot. So I'm going to be happy to be here. Back.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
I hope that you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington Brazil office. If you missed our live broadcast of Dialogues for Democracy, in which experts talk about the situation in Brazil, you can find our videos on this channel. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star review to help other people find the program. Until next time, até a próxima.